It was late in the evening, the kind of night where the streets are quiet, and the hum of distant traffic is the only sound breaking the calm. A high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army had finished a long day inspecting troops at a nearby base. His uniform was neatly folded under his coat, a sign of the long day he had endured. His mind was occupied with the day's reports, the schedules he had to approve, and the small decisions that made the difference between a well-run unit and chaos. He just wanted to get home, rest, and maybe call his family before sleep took over. The road he drove on was familiar. He had traveled it countless times before, both in uniform and off-duty. The streetlights cast long shadows across the asphalt, and the occasional passing car reminded him that even at this hour, life went on. He noticed a patrol car behind him a few miles from the base, its lights off. He thought little of it at first, assuming the officer was simply patrolling the area like usual, but as he continued, the car stayed unusually close, keeping pace with him as he drove. After a few minutes, the patrol car flicked its lights on, signaling him to pull over. The general complied immediately, pulling his vehicle to the side of the road. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel and took a deep breath, ready for what should have been a routine stop. He knew the law, and he respected the process. He reached for his license and registration. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, the officer approached his car with a tense stride, his eyes narrow. He asked for identification and documents in a tone that was more commanding than polite. The general handed over his license and registration calmly, explaining that he had just finished work at the base. The officer barely looked at the papers and muttered something under his breath. A comment about his suspicious behavior and odd timing. The general felt a twinge of frustration, but held it back. He had learned over years of service that staying calm could prevent things from escalating. The officer circled the car, steps quick, almost jittery, and then returned to his side. He questioned the general further, asking where he was coming from, where he was going, and why he seemed so tense. The general answered politely, repeating the truth. He had been on the base all day and was now heading home. He could see the officer's skepticism, the way his eyes scanned the car, as if he expected to find something illegal hidden inside. There was nothing there, of course. It's just a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. Minutes passed like hours. The officer kept talking, pushing questions, raising his voice slightly. The general remained respectful, careful not to argue. He could sense that the officer's judgment was clouded, that bias was creeping into the situation. He had experienced prejudice before, both subtle and overt, but this felt different. The officer's tone was sharper, his movements more aggressive. The general's heart rate increased slightly, but he did not panic. He knew that remaining calm was the only way to ensure the situation did not spiral out of control. Suddenly, the officer ordered him out of the car. The general's mind raced for a moment. He understood the officer's authority, but he also understood his rights. He kept his hands raised as he stepped out, explaining again that he was a U.S. Army officer returning from the base. The officer ignored this and instructed him to place his hands behind his back. Confused citizens occasionally watched from the shadows, their phones faintly lighting their faces as they recorded the scene. The general's pulse quickened, not out of fear of the law, but because he could see how quickly bias could turn a routine stop into something dangerous. A second patrol car arrived, its lights flashing briefly before settling into a steady glow. The second officer stepped out, observing the scene silently. He exchanged a few words with the first officer, his face showing concern. From the general's perspective, the second officer seemed more measured, more careful. The first officer, however, continued to assert authority aggressively, insisting the general was hiding something and that his vehicle plates didn't match the records. The general knew this was false. His plates were correct, his documents in order, but the officer refused to listen. Dismissing every explanation, the general realized that his reputation, his years of service, and even his rank carried no weight here. All that mattered to this officer was the color of his skin and a preconceived notion that he must be doing something wrong. He had faced challenges before, tough decisions on the battlefield, tense negotiations, and moments when his leadership was questioned, but nothing compared to the feeling of being wrongly accused in his own country. While in uniform, as he was handcuffed on the side of the road, he kept his tone steady. He did not shout, he did not plead aggressively, and he did not make sudden movements. He had trained for situations of stress and danger, and he knew that his calm demeanor could prevent harm. People passing by slowed their cars, some filming, others watching with disbelief. The general's mind stayed focused. He thought of his family, of the soldiers who relied on him, and of the principle that truth and patience often outlast anger and prejudice. Inside the patrol car, the general remained composed. The first officer was talking on the radio, possibly giving a version of events that cast the general as suspicious. The second officer looked uncomfortable, silently observing, clearly aware that something about this arrest was off. The general knew he would have to make a choice carefully. Any wrong word could escalate the situation. He remained polite, answering questions briefly, providing facts without emotion. He also noticed the small things that told him the officer was not impartial. The tone of voice, the insistence on unnecessary procedures, the way he ignored the general's military credentials. These were subtle signs that bias, not law, was guiding the officer's decisions. Yet the general held on to his principles. He had faced adversity his entire career, from harsh training to the pressures of command. This, he told himself, was another test of patience and dignity. As the patrol car slowly moved toward the station, the general reflected on how easily a routine night could turn into a life-altering event. He knew that if he lost control of his emotions, if he argued or resisted, the outcome could have been very different. He also realized that this was a moment that would stay with him. A reminder that even those who serve their country with honor can face unfair treatment. He prepared himself for what came next, knowing that once at the station, the situation could escalate further. His training, his discipline, and his composure were all he could rely on. The second officer's presence gave him a small measure of reassurance, knowing that not everyone saw him through the lens of prejudice. He quietly hoped that reason and honesty would prevail once his identity and credentials were fully recognized. Through it all, he remained focused on one thing: truth. The truth of who he was, of his service, and of the unfairness he was experiencing. He understood that staying calm and patient was not just for his safety, but also a demonstration of the principles he had upheld his entire career. No matter how biased or unfair the officer's actions, he would not allow the situation to compromise his integrity or dignity. The night stretched on. The patrol car moving steadily under the streetlights, each mile bringing him closer to the station and deeper into a situation that tested not just his patience, but the very values he had dedicated his life to defending. Every step, every word, every calm breath mattered. He had faced challenges in his career, but none were quite like this standing on the side of the road. Handcuffed, judged not for his actions, but for the assumptions of another. And yet, even in that tense moment, he remained composed. He knew the story was not over, and that patience, courage, and the unwavering commitment to truth would guide him through what was about to unfold. The patrol car arrived at the small, dimly lit station, the hum of fluorescent lights greeting them as they pulled into the lot. The general sat quietly in the back seat, his hands still cuffed, his expression calm. He watched as the first officer, the one who had pulled him over, stepped out and moved toward the entrance with a brisk pace, radio in hand. The second officer followed, slower, more deliberate, his eyes flicking back to the general every few seconds. There was tension in the air that went beyond the ordinary. It was the kind of tension that comes when authority meets a challenge it did not expect. Inside the station, the first officer began the usual routine. He asked the general to step out of the vehicle, which he did carefully, keeping his hands raised and movements slow. The general's mind was sharp, taking in every detail of the room, the placement of desks, the officers milling about, the faint smell of coffee and cleaning products, the flicker of the fluorescent lights above. Every detail mattered, because in situations like this, small things could make a difference. The officer escorted him to a small interview room, one that looked stark and unwelcoming. With a table and 2 chairs, a camera in the corner, and a single door leading out, The general sat down when instructed, keeping his posture straight, showing respect, while also conveying a quiet confidence. He knew that he was being judged not just by the officer in front of him, but by the process itself. He had faced scrutiny before, in far more critical situations, and he understood the power of calm composure. The first officer began to write up the report, his pen moving quickly across the paper. He muttered accusations under his breath, framing the general's presence as suspicious. He claimed the car's plates did not match the records, and insisted the general had been evasive on the road. The general listened patiently, interjecting only to correct facts calmly and politely. He explained again that he had been at the base all day, that his vehicle was properly registered, and that his identification could be verified. The officer barely looked up, his focus on proving some perceived wrongdoing rather than seeking the truth. The general could feel the bias in the room. It was in the officer's tone, in the way he leaned back in his chair, in the way he ignored the documents and credentials presented. The general had encountered prejudice before, but this was subtle and aggressive, hidden behind the guise of procedure. He understood that this kind of bias was dangerous because it could escalate without anyone realizing it. A few minutes later, the second officer, who had arrived earlier, stepped into the room. His demeanor was different. He spoke quietly, measured, and with a hint of concern. He observed the first officer for a moment before looking at the general. There was an unspoken acknowledgement in his eyes, a recognition that something was not right. He did not speak at length, but the way he stood, hands loosely clasped in front, suggested he was weighing his options. The first officer continued, insisting that the general had been uncooperative and that the vehicle's registration seemed inconsistent. He pushed the point, writing notes, making calls to dispatch, and acting as if he had uncovered a dangerous criminal. The general remained calm, answering questions directly and without emotion, careful not to inflame the situation. He knew that any sign of anger or frustration could be used against him. At one point, the first officer asked the general to explain why he had not pulled over immediately when first signaled. The general explained simply, he had recognized the officer's vehicle and was stopping safely, aware of the need to maintain control of his car on a quiet road. He spoke slowly, clearly, with respect, hoping that logic would reach the officer's mind. The first officer did not seem convinced. He scribbled in his notes, muttering under his breath, and then looked up with a firm, almost accusatory gaze. The tension in the room was thick. The general could sense that the situation had escalated far beyond what it should have been. He had served in high-pressure environments, made life-and-death decisions, and led troops under fire. Yet the stress of being treated unfairly by someone with authority felt like a unique kind of trial. He focused on breathing evenly, keeping his mind clear, and remembering the principles that had guided his career: patience, integrity, and respect. Time passed slowly. The first officer continued to type up his report, calling dispatch repeatedly to verify details that were already correct. The general answered every question, providing proof where he could, and remaining as composed as ever. The second officer watched quietly, occasionally nodding in subtle agreement with what the general was saying, but careful not to challenge his partner openly. The general understood that this silence was a small but significant form of support. At one point, first officer slammed his pen on the table, startling the general slightly. He looked up, his expression hard, his voice sharper. He accused the general of lying, of trying to evade responsibility, and of not respecting the law. The general remained calm, his tone steady, explaining once more the truth. He spoke of his work at the base that day, of the distance traveled, of the uniform he wore, and of the documents in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He simply stated the facts. The general could feel the weight of the situation pressing down, but he did not allow it to rattle him. He knew that remaining calm, measured, and respectful was his best defense. He also recognized that this incident was not just about him, it was about a larger principle. The idea that justice should be impartial and that authority should be exercised responsibly. As the first officer continued to write and make calls, the general requested politely if he could make one phone call. The officer hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He muttered something about special privileges, and not everyone gets a phone call, clearly attempting to assert control. The general repeated his request calmly, without anger or frustration. He explained that he needed to confirm certain details for his own safety and verification. The officer, after a long pause, finally allowed it. Perhaps expecting it to be a simple, unimportant conversation, the general dialed a secure number, his hand steady. As he spoke, the room seemed to grow quieter, the first officer's movements slowing as he listened. The words spoken were calm, professional, and clear. Within moments, the tension shifted slightly. The second officer leaned forward, listening intently. The first officer's face changed, his confidence faltering as he realized that the person he had detained was far more significant than he had assumed. The general stayed composed during the call, not raising his voice, not showing frustration, simply providing facts and explaining the situation. He mentioned his identity, his rank, and his location. He spoke with authority, but with a quiet calm that commanded respect. The room's energy shifted. The first officer, once aggressive and assertive, now seemed uncertain, almost defensive. The second officer looked relieved, sensing that the balance of power in the room had changed. While on the phone, the general calmly reviewed the details in his mind. He thought about how quickly assumptions and bias could turn routine actions into dangerous situations. He reflected on his training, his experience, and the principle that fairness and patience often overcome aggression and ignorance. He also thought about how he had to handle this situation carefully, knowing that a wrong move could escalate the tension unnecessarily. The first officer, meanwhile, fumbled with his paperwork, muttering excuses to himself. He could no longer maintain the same aggressive posture. The second officer subtly tried to intervene, suggesting quietly that verification was underway. The general continued his conversation, providing clear, concise information, ensuring that the higher authorities understood the situation fully by the end of the call. The first officer was pale, his earlier confidence replaced by a mix of worry and embarrassment. The second officer offered a small nod of reassurance to the general, acknowledging the courage and composure he had maintained. The general hung up the phone calmly, taking a deep breath and keeping his posture straight. He had faced one of the most uncomfortable situations of his career, yet he had remained composed and respectful. Letting the truth speak for itself, the general realized that in moments like this, patience, courage, and integrity were his greatest allies. He had encountered prejudice, unfair treatment, and assumptions, but he had handled them in a way that maintained his dignity and safety. He knew that the next steps would unfold quickly, that accountability and recognition were imminent, and that his calm approach had set the stage for resolution, even as the tension lingered in the room. The general remained steady. He understood that authority should be exercised with care, that bias could have serious consequences, and that remaining composed in the face of unfair treatment was a powerful statement. He focused on what he could control: his words, his actions, and his calm presence. And in that quiet, tense room, a lesson was unfolding, not just for him, but for those who had judged him unfairly. It was a lesson in patience, in respect, and in the power of staying true to one's principles, even when challenged by ignorance and prejudice. The general had faced countless challenges in his career, but this was a unique test, one that required not courage in battle, but courage in truth, in composure, and in the quiet assertion of dignity. The general sat in the small interview room, the hum of the fluorescent lights above him filling the silence that had settled after the phone call. The first officer, who had been so aggressive just minutes before, now seemed uneasy. His hands shook slightly as he shuffled papers, trying to maintain a sense of authority that had begun slipping away. The second officer stayed close by, quiet and watchful, a subtle reminder that not everyone in the room saw the situation the same way. The general remained calm, his posture straight, hands visible on the table, eyes steady. He knew this was a critical moment. The room was tense. The first officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. He asked the general questions that he already knew the answers to. Where had he been? What had he been doing? Why had he not pulled over immediately? The general answered politely, calmly, never raising his voice. He knew that any display of frustration could be twisted. Any sign of impatience could make the situation worse. He focused on speaking the truth, clearly and firmly, letting his words carry weight through their honesty. The second officer, observing silently, exchanged a glance with a dispatcher outside the room. Something had shifted. The dispatcher's voice came through the radio, cautious but direct, asking for verification of the general's statements. The first officer frowned, realizing that his earlier assumptions were being challenged. The tension in the room thickened as the truth began to surface. The general's credentials, his service record, and his identity were being confirmed, and the first officer's confidence faltered. For the general, every second mattered. He'd been trained to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when others around him were panicked or aggressive. He understood that in moments like these, patience was more powerful than anger. He could feel the first officer's unease growing, a subtle shift from authority to uncertainty, and he remained composed, observing quietly, speaking only when necessary. His demeanor was steady, his voice calm, and his eyes focused, conveying confidence without arrogance. The first officer tried to argue, insisting that he had acted correctly, that the general's behavior had seemed suspicious, that the vehicle plates had raised questions. The general listened without interruption, nodding politely. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and precise. He explained again the facts, his tone respectful but firm, making it clear that truth and procedure were on his side. He spoke not with anger but with authority. The room shifted in response. Outside the small room, the phone lines were busy. Calls were being made, messages relayed, and the higher-ups in the Pentagon were now aware of the situation. Within minutes, the first officer's initial certainty was replaced with a nervous tension he could not hide. He glanced at the second officer, who met his eyes with quiet acknowledgement. The general, calm and composed, waited patiently. Knowing that the truth would emerge fully without him needing to escalate his tone or actions, the first officer continued to write notes. But his hand was less steady than before. He made additional calls to dispatch, asking for further verification, and each time the response confirmed what the general had said. He began to realize that he had misjudged the situation entirely. The general's military identification, rank, and service record were all authentic and beyond question. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier, as the weight of the officer's mistake settled in. The general observed everything, every gesture, every word, every subtle change in demeanor. He knew that this was more than just a personal encounter. It was a moment that revealed how bias and assumption could escalate a situation unnecessarily. He thought about the lessons he had learned in the military, how leadership was about patience, observation, and making decisions based on facts rather than emotions. He understood that his calmness and clarity were tools as powerful as any rank or title. As the minutes passed, the first officer's attempts to maintain authority became weaker. He stammered at times, muttered under his breath, and occasionally glanced at the door as if considering retreat. The second officer remained composed, quietly observing the unfolding events, silently supporting the general with his calm presence. The general himself remained steady, his hands resting on the table, his eyes clear, and his voice measured. Finally, the first officer paused, his pen resting on the paper, his hands folded. He looked at the general with a mixture of confusion and unease. He realized that the person before him was not just a military officer, but someone who carried years of experience, discipline, and authority that could not be dismissed. The weight of his earlier bias became evident, and for the first time he seemed unsure of his next move. The general remained silent for a moment, letting the first officer process the reality. He knew that patience was essential here, that rushing, arguing, or displaying frustration could undo the careful balance he had maintained. His experience had taught him that in moments of tension, composure could accomplish more than confrontation. He maintained his calm, projecting confidence and dignity without aggression. At that moment, the phone rang again, a call from higher up. The room fell silent. The general answered calmly, speaking clearly, verifying his identity. and explaining the situation once more. The first officer listened, a shadow of disbelief on his face. The second officer leaned slightly forward, aware that the call was confirming everything the general had stated. Within minutes, orders came through. The general was to be released immediately, and all records and body cam footage were to be reviewed. The first officer's posture slumped, his earlier aggression replaced with a nervous tension. He realized that his actions were being scrutinized, and that the consequences of bias could extend far beyond the room he occupied. The general remained composed, acknowledging the phone instructions with a simple nod. He did not gloat, did not shout, did not express anger. He simply observed as the situation began to shift in his favor. The second officer quietly began making notes, documenting what had occurred, ensuring that the record reflected the truth of the encounter. The general appreciated this subtle support, understanding that allies could sometimes be silent, yet their presence and actions mattered greatly. He focused on what he could control, his own behavior, his composure, and the clarity of the facts he had presented. As the first officer continued to process the orders, the general reflected on the night's events. He thought about how easily a simple traffic stop had escalated, how quickly assumptions could turn a routine encounter into a moment of tension and danger. He considered the impact of bias, the importance of verifying facts, and the value of calm authority. These reflections were not just personal, they were lessons for everyone in the room. The general understood that accountability was about more than punishment. It was about recognition of error, correction, and learning. He had seen similar situations in his career where leaders had failed to exercise patience or had let prejudice dictate decisions. In those cases, the consequences had been severe. Tonight, he had avoided escalation through calm, clear, and measured actions. Finally, the first officer motioned for the handcuffs to be removed. The general complied calmly, lifting his hands and allowing the restraints to be taken off without resistance. There was no triumph in his eyes, no anger, only a quiet confidence, and a steady reminder of the principles he had lived by throughout his career. The first officer seemed embarrassed, unsure of what to say. The second officer offered a quiet, polite acknowledgement to the general, a small gesture of respect and understanding. The general stood, adjusted his coat, and prepared to leave the room. He knew the situation was far from over. There would be investigations, reports, and accountability measures. But for now, he had navigated a dangerous and unfair situation with dignity. He had maintained his composure, allowed the truth to speak for itself, and ensured that fairness and respect prevailed without escalating conflict. As he walked toward the door, the general noticed the first officer avoiding eye contact, his hands fidgeting slightly. The second officer held the door open, a subtle reminder of support. The general stepped out calmly, acknowledging the presence of those in the station with a quiet nod. He had faced prejudice, confrontation, and bias, yet he had emerged without compromising his principles or dignity. The night air outside was cool and calm, a stark contrast to the tension inside the station. The general paused for a moment, taking in the quiet streets, the distant hum of cars, and the faint glow of streetlights. He reflected on the events, on the importance of patience, integrity, and calm authority. He knew that moments like these tested character far more than any battlefield challenge ever could, and as he prepared for the next steps, the general carried with him the understanding that courage was not always about confrontation or force. Sometimes it was about calm persistence, clear communication, and the quiet power of truth. He had faced an unjust situation and handled it with dignity, ensuring that fairness, respect, and integrity prevailed. Even in the face of bias and error, the moment the call to the Pentagon was made, the atmosphere inside the station began to shift. Phones rang off the hook, and officers hurried to answer them, trying to relay messages as fast as they could. The first officer, who had been so aggressive before, now seemed to shrink under the weight of authority. His confident posture was gone, replaced with nervous movements, his pen trembling slightly as he fumbled with the paperwork on his desk. The second officer, standing nearby, quietly observed the unfolding events, silently affirming the truth that had been evident from the start. Soon, a higher-ranking officer entered the station. His presence was commanding, but he moved quickly and deliberately, scanning the room with sharp eyes. He asked for the general's location and was informed immediately. Within minutes, he was at the door of the interview room, accompanied by a small group of officers, each carrying a look of serious concern. The first officer tried to explain the situation, but his words faltered under the scrutiny of authority. He realized that the situation was now far beyond anything he could control. The general remained seated, calm and composed, watching as the room changed around him. He had been trained to handle pressure, to remain steady when others panicked, and this moment was no different. He observed the officers, noting their expressions and body language, understanding that they were reacting not out of malice, but out of surprise and the need to reconcile the situation with protocol. The general knew that staying calm was not just about self-control. It was about demonstrating leadership. Even in moments when he had no formal command, the high-ranking officer approached the general, his voice firm but respectful. He confirmed the general's identity and asked a few brief questions about the events. Leading up to his arrival at the station, the general answered clearly, calmly, and respectfully, detailing the events from the traffic stop to the moment he had requested the phone call. He did not exaggerate, he did not raise his voice, and he did not show frustration. His composure spoke louder than any words could. Meanwhile, the first officer grew increasingly uneasy. He attempted to defend his actions, citing procedures and regulations. But his words fell flat against the evidence and the calm authority of the general. He had assumed power in the moment, but the truth had revealed the extent of his mistake. The second officer, who had observed from the beginning, quietly supported the general's account without confrontation, documenting facts and verifying statements when necessary as more calls came in. It became clear that the Pentagon had been fully briefed. Instructions were immediate and direct. The general was to be released at once, all handcuffs removed, and any official records of the stop reviewed thoroughly. Orders were given to ensure that all video footage and body cam recordings were preserved and that a formal review of the first officer's conduct would occur. The weight of accountability began to settle over the room like a heavy cloud. The first officer shifted uncomfortably, realizing the gravity of the situation. His initial assumptions, fueled by bias and impatience, were being scrutinized by people with far more authority. The room that had once been filled with tension now carried a sense of inevitability. The truth had arrived, and there was no escaping it. The general remained calm, listening as instructions were relayed, acknowledging each detail with quiet professionalism. He did not gloat or show satisfaction. He knew that dignity was more important than vindication. Other officers in the station began to recognize the error. They exchanged subtle glances, some nodding quietly, others stepping forward to assist with the verification process. The first officer's credibility was visibly eroding, replaced by a mix of embarrassment and anxiety. He had assumed authority based on flawed assumptions, but the system he relied upon had corrected him, proving the importance of fairness, patience, and verification. The general stood when instructed, his posture straight, and calmly allowed the handcuffs to be removed. There was a silence in the room as officers watched him, a combination of respect and realization that they had witnessed someone handle a situation with extraordinary composure. The general did not speak harshly or demand apologies. He simply acknowledged the actions of those around him with a polite nod, letting his behavior demonstrate the strength of character that had guided his life and career. The higher-ranking officer gave clear instructions to document every detail, emphasizing that the incident would be reviewed carefully. He reminded the first officer that accountability was not optional and that errors caused by assumptions and bias could have serious consequences. The first officer nodded silently, the weight of the lesson pressing down. Understanding that his actions had been observed and evaluated by the highest levels of authority, meanwhile, the general's focus remained on ensuring that the situation was resolved professionally. He spoke quietly to the second officer, thanking him for his discretion and support. The second officer responded with a subtle nod, acknowledging that fairness and calm judgment had prevailed. The room, once filled with tension and uncertainty, began to settle as the process of correction took shape. The general's composure had a ripple effect. Other officers in the station, who had initially assumed routine authority, began to recognize the importance of patience and verification. They saw how quickly assumptions could escalate, how bias could cloud judgment, and how dignity and calm authority could restore order without conflict. The general had not raised his voice. He had not threatened anyone. Yet his presence and professionalism had changed the dynamics of the room completely. The first officer was quietly instructed to prepare a full report detailing his actions, the decisions he made, and the assumptions that had influenced him. He was informed that a review would follow, including recommendations for training and oversight. The officer realized the seriousness of the situation. This was not merely a mistake, but a lesson in accountability, bias, and the proper use of authority. The general, meanwhile, prepared to leave. He adjusted his coat, checked his belongings, and stood tall. The officers around him made way, some offering subtle gestures of respect, others remaining silent, processing the events they had witnessed. The general's calm, measured approach had diffused a potentially explosive situation. And he had done so without confrontation, aggression, or anger. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him. The quiet streets and distant hum of traffic contrasted sharply with the intensity inside the station. The general took a deep breath, reflecting on the events. He understood that moments like this tested character, patience, and judgment more than any battlefield challenge. He had remained composed, upheld his principles, and ensured that truth and fairness prevailed. The general walked to his car, the first officer standing nearby, visibly shaken, while the second officer quietly assisted with verifying his documents and ensuring the vehicle was ready. The general did not speak harshly or lecture. He simply acknowledged the presence of everyone around him with quiet dignity. His actions were a demonstration of leadership, showing that respect and patience could achieve far more than anger or confrontation ever could. As he drove away from the station, the general reflected on the lessons of the night. He thought about how quickly assumptions could escalate, a bias could influence decisions, and how calm, measured actions could restore order. He understood that accountability, patience, and integrity were not just values to be spoken about, but principles to be lived. Especially in moments of tension and challenge, the first officer remained at the station, processing the events, preparing reports, and facing the reality of oversight and accountability. The second officer quietly returned to duty, carrying with him the knowledge that truth and fairness had prevailed. And the general, driving home under the quiet night sky, carried with him the confidence that he had handled a dangerous and unfair situation with grace, professionalism, and unwavering dignity. He knew that the story was not over. Reports would be written, reviews conducted, and lessons learned. But he also knew that his calm, respectful, and principled approach had set the tone for resolution. It was a reminder that courage was not always loud or confrontational, that strength could be quiet, and that fairness and truth could prevail even in the face of bias and error. As the night grew deeper, the general arrived home, parked his car, and took a moment to look at the familiar surroundings. The tension of the evening slowly began to fade, replaced by a quiet reflection on the importance of patience, composure, and the power of integrity. He had faced an unfair situation, navigated it with calm authority, and ensured that accountability would follow. And in that quiet moment, the general understood that his actions were more than just a personal victory. They were a demonstration of the principles he had dedicated his life to: fairness, patience, respect, and integrity. The night had tested him, and he had responded not with anger, but with strength, not with confrontation, but with calm authority. He had faced bias and error, and through careful, measured actions, had ensured that truth and accountability prevailed. The general stepped out of the station, the cool night air brushing against his face. It was quiet now, the tension of the past hours leaving only a stillness that felt heavy but relieved. His car waited where he had parked it, and he moved toward it slowly, aware of the eyes of the officers who had remained behind. Some watched silently, some avoided looking, their their expressions reflecting a mixture of embarrassment, realization, and understanding. The general did not speak harshly or chastise anyone. He simply maintained his calm posture, demonstrating the quiet authority that had carried him through every challenge of the evening. The first officer, the one who had initially pulled him over, stood nearby. Fidgeting with his pen and shifting his weight from foot to foot, his confident demeanor was gone, replaced by uncertainty and discomfort. He had been confronted not by anger or confrontation, but by truth and composure. The weight of the situation pressed down on him now more than ever. He had made assumptions based on bias, and those assumptions had been exposed. He realized that the consequences of prejudice and rash decisions were far greater than he had imagined. The second officer, who had observed calmly from the beginning, offered a quiet acknowledgement to the general as he approached his car. It was a small gesture, but it carried respect and recognition for the way the general had handled the entire situation. The general nodded slightly in return, appreciating the support, even if subtle. In that moment, he understood the value of allies who acted with discretion and fairness, who recognized right from wrong without needing to be in the spotlight. As he opened the car door, the general took a deep breath, steadying himself. The events of the night had tested his patience, composure, and judgment, but he had navigated them with the same principles that had guided his military career: respect, integrity, and calm authority. He reflected on how quickly situations could escalate when assumptions and bias came into play, and how important it was to remain composed in order to allow truth to surface. The first officer approached him hesitantly, his hand slightly raised in a gesture that seemed to mix apology with uncertainty. The general looked at him calmly, his expression steady. He did not raise his voice, he did not shout, and he did not belittle the man who had treated him unfairly. Instead, he spoke quietly, reminding the officer that respect and fairness should guide every interaction, regardless of rank, uniform, or skin color. His words were firm, but not angry, leaving a lasting impression that authority needed to be exercised responsibly. The first officer listened, nodding slowly, the reality of his mistakes settling in. The general's calmness and professionalism had made it clear that the earlier aggression and assumptions were not just wrong, but avoidable. He realized that true leadership, whether in the military or in law enforcement, was about patience, fairness, and accountability. The lesson was undeniable, and it would remain with him for the rest of his career. The general then turned to leave, climbing into his car with a sense of quiet resolve. He did not hurry. The night was still, the streets empty, allowing him a moment to reflect. He thought about the importance of composure, how it could diffuse even the most tense situations, and how dignity and patience could be far more powerful than confrontation. He had faced prejudice, unfair treatment, and aggressive assumptions, yet he had emerged without losing his principles or his calm as he drove away from the station. He noticed the subtle ways the officers were handling the aftermath. The first officer was already writing a detailed report, documenting everything that had occurred, aware that an investigation and review would follow. The second officer was assisting with organization and verification, quietly ensuring that the facts were clear. Even in their different ways, the officers were participating in a process that emphasized accountability and correction. The general understood that this was the beginning of a necessary change, a reminder that fairness and integrity could not be ignored on the way home. The general reflected on the larger meaning of the night. He had experienced firsthand how bias and assumption could create dangerous situations. He had also witnessed the power of calmness, patience, and truth. The experience reinforced the importance of principles over pride, composure over confrontation, and of integrity over impulsiveness. It was a reminder that real strength often lay not in force or aggression, but in quiet courage and the ability to stay true to one's values, even when challenged. When he arrived home, the general parked his car and stepped out, taking a moment to breathe deeply. The night was calm, peaceful, and the lights of the neighborhood shone softly in the distance. He felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering awareness of the events that had transpired. He knew that the officers involved would be held accountable, that reviews would take place, and that lessons would be learned. Yet he also knew that the most important aspect was how he had conducted himself: steadfast, calm, and principled. As he entered his home, he was greeted by a sense of normalcy and comfort. The warmth and familiarity of the surroundings reminded him of the life he protected and served. He thought of the countless decisions he had made throughout his career, and he realized that this evening had been another test, not on the battlefield, but in everyday life, demonstrating that courage and dignity were just as important outside of combat. The following days brought official reviews and accountability measures. The first officer was subjected to a thorough investigation. His actions were scrutinized, his bias acknowledged, and recommendations for retraining and oversight were made. It was a difficult but necessary process, one that highlighted the importance of fairness and the consequences of assumptions. The second officer's quiet support and accurate reporting were recognized, showing that integrity could sometimes shine subtly without fanfare, yet still make a difference. The general returned to duty, continuing his responsibilities with the same dedication as always. He did not boast about the incident, nor did he seek recognition. Instead, he carried with him the knowledge that patience, calmness, and principled action could influence outcomes more than force or confrontation ever could. The event became a quiet story of resilience and integrity, one that would influence those around him and remind others of the importance of accountability and fairness within the department. The story circulated, not as a tale of anger or conflict, but as a demonstration of the power of professionalism and dignity. Officers began to reflect on how assumptions could cloud judgment, how bias could escalate situations, and how calm authority could resolve even the most tense moments. The general's actions became a model for leadership, emphasizing that respect and integrity were essential in every interaction. The first officer, having faced the investigation, began retraining and oversight programs. He learned firsthand the consequences of assumptions and bias, the importance of listening carefully, verifying facts, and exercising authority with care. It was a humbling experience, but one that reinforced the need for fairness and accountability in law enforcement. The lessons learned that night would stay with him for the rest of his career, shaping his decisions and approach to others. The general, meanwhile, continued his work quietly. He interacted with his colleagues, led his teams, and managed his responsibilities with the same calm determination. The events of the night had not shaken him. They had strengthened his commitment to principles, fairness, and leadership. He knew that courage was not always loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, measured, and grounded in integrity. As the story came to a close, it was clear that the general's calm composure, respect for procedure, and adherence to truth had made all the difference. He had faced bias and aggression, yet he had navigated the situation with dignity and authority. The officers around him had witnessed the power of patience and principle, and the lessons of that night would resonate long after the incident itself had passed. In the end, the general's example stood as a reminder that true strength lay not in confrontation or anger, but in the ability to remain calm, clear, and principled. He had shown that even in moments of unfair treatment and challenge, it was possible to uphold dignity, enforce truth, and inspire accountability. The night had tested him, and he had responded not with force, but with the quiet courage of integrity and the enduring power of calm authority. The officers at the station, the community who had observed parts of the situation, and the colleagues at the Pentagon all took note of the lessons. Bias and assumptions had been confronted, accountability had been enforced, and fairness had prevailed. The general's actions became an example of leadership, showing that respect, patience, and truths were far more powerful than aggression or prejudice. And so, the night ended not with conflict or resentment, but with reflection and understanding. The general returned to his life and duties, carrying the quiet knowledge that courage could be calm, strength could be dignified, and fairness could prevail, even in moments when the odds seemed against it. The story of the evening became a lasting reminder that integrity, patience, and principled action could overcome bias, correct error, and inspire others to act with fairness and respect in every situation.